the way in which the media covers sport has changed. And I specifically want to look at the period of time between 1980 and the present day. And the present day for me, as I record this, actually, I'm recording this in March 2020. March 2022 even. You'll see a couple of examples of that in a second. But what I've sort of tried to picture here, if we look at, for example, television, I've tried to picture this notion that TV looked a little bit like this in 1980, and here we have the BT Sport interactive timeline through their digital app, and you see this sort of change into the present day. And by the way, you youngsters out there who think that this is very, very old-fashioned, I had the actual television in my bedroom during the 1980s, and I thought I was ever so modern, so it will happen to you too. But let's look at some of the characteristics of changes to TV. So first of all, there is just simply more coverage. And what I mean by that is that more sport is covered and is processed via the media than was the case in the 1980s. That is absolutely the case. We also have, of course, a major increase in technology as sport entertainment. So for example, you can see on that BT Sport app that I've used as my example, we've got that kind of interactive timeline. I can click on this yellow card, I can go back and look at this goal. It becomes a form of entertainment, an actual form of light entertainment really. We also get the idea that less elite sport is free to air. So we've got less elite sport free to air because it's got commercial value. That commercial value is exploited. So of course the BT Sport app, for example, is a paid service that needs to be paid on in addition to any other kind of free services. We can go a little bit further and we can say that there's more viewer choice. Okay, that seems positive, right? There's more viewer choice. You know, you can sign up with Sky, or you can sign up with BT or DAZN or whatever it happens to be, but it gives people more choice. And of course, there's more being shown, as we've mentioned before. Now, I happen to be linking off this whole object. I'm not saying this is from the 80s, by the way. We also still have the notion today of protected sports. So think about your FIFA World Cup, think about your Olympic Games, think about, I think from memory, your Open Golf Championships. These are protective sports and they must be free to view, okay? So even though we've got these commercial pressures and changes around the TV, this structure still remains. The Olympics is a really good example of that. We've also got the development today of satellite and digital. Now, I'm absolutely sure that you will have this provision in your home or you'll have access to it at some point. But of course, previously, this was through an analog service. It was literally through waves passing through the air. Now, of course, we're now talking about a satellite or a digital signal coming through cable. That's a different methodology. In fact, I believe from memory, the analog signal in the UK has actually now been turned off. It might be worth checking that one. People also tend these days far more commonly to buy subscription services. This will be pretty standard for you, but that was not always the case. I actually remember the introduction of Sky Sports back in the day, in the first time, and it was quite a shock that you could do that. We've even today, and really quite common, have the idea of pay-per-view events. Now these have become kind of interesting because you've got the notion of entertainers and sports mixing. I'm thinking around the Paul brothers and things like this, Logan Paul fighting Floyd Mayweather, for example. Therefore, I want to make this point, we've also got integrated social media, okay? And that is both from the perspective that you can, of course, communicate via social media while an event is occurring, but perhaps more importantly, social media is the platform which these can be sold or even publicised and covered in YouTube Spaces, for example. And finally, we get a massive increase in sponsorship. And notice the word massive there. Massive increase, which I done with two eyes, in sponsorship. I'll just put in sponsors. So, of course, that brings an increase in commercialisation. So these are the changes in TV coverage. Now, I also want to address the changes to radio coverage. Now, again, this radio might look well old-fashioned to you, this tape deck, but this was all the thing. The reason I chose this one is like the really nice physical buttons. I mean, the experience of previously tuning in a radio. I reckon some of you will have done that. I reckon none of you, though, have tuned in manually a TV like all of us who lived in the 80s or grew up in the 80s did. But what are the changes to radio? And again, we're looking at the differences between 1980 to today. That's really the question we're trying to answer. So I guess the biggest one is the introduction of DAB or digital radio. That has increased massively access to channels and also international channels. We've also got the notion of dedicated sports stations. Okay, so we've got dedicated sports stations. Think about your talk sport as an example of that. Let me actually put that in. I'll put in talk sport as an example of that. We could talk about something like BBC Radio 5 Live, not entirely sports, but very majorly so. We've also got the notion that we've got local radio coverage. Okay, so what we get now is, let's say that you're you're a Northampton Town football supporter, for example. Local radio live coverage. What they'll tend to do is you'll get some kind of local Northamptonshire radio that then broadcast that game. I personally tune in very commonly to BBC Radio Nottingham because I'm a Nottingham Forest supporter, even though I live in the south of England. There's some examples of that change. Now, obviously far fewer there. Now, the last thing I want to sort of address here is the change, again, from 1980, not that photo is from 1980, but very much focused on the printing press, to the present, and here we are talking about the written press. Now, I've sort of made an insinuation here that the written press now is far less physical, newspapers, magazines, etc., and is now far more digital, for example, websites. I've chosen the BBC Sport homepage. But what we're saying here is that we get a serious decline in physical sales. So the number of units being sold of a, Sun newspaper. Actually, I'm not going to use that example. There's numerous reasons I don't want to talk about them. But let's say with the Daily Express sport pages, that newspaper will have far fewer physical sales than it did back in the 80s because people have access to the internet. Therefore, these online publications are a major change to the way the written press works. Far more now, the written press is after your clicks than it is your pennies to buy the paper itself. Let's finish this off strongly. Good examples of this, one's over here. We've got things like the BBC Sport homepage, one of the most popular websites in the UK, for example. You could say Sky Sports homepage is an example, BT, all kinds of examples. You probably use other ones yourselves. And I'm also going to say here that magazines, and these being physical magazines, are still popular. Okay, so the one type of printed press that's sort of holding its own a little bit at least is magazines, and they're still really effective at selling things like advertising. So these are changes that have occurred around media coverage. Really make sure that you can differentiate between the written press, the radio and the TV, and it's from 1980 until the present. I miss the 1980s. I was a boy and a teenager during them. It was bloody good fun, and you should give a bit of respect to anyone that lived through it. Cheers.